Star Wars 7x7 episode 3052. In the last episode of the Andor series, Luthen Rael gave us about as much insight into his backstory as we may well get, albeit very cryptically. We're going to take a look at what he said and how he said it and try and see what it actually tells us about this mysterious man. Punch it! Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy, and thank you so much for joining me for it. So before we jump into this, I do just want to say that all of this talk about Luthen makes me want to know more about Clea. I mean, we don't know what her deal is. We know she's running the antique shop / museum space with Luthen. We know she's deeply involved in the rebel organization efforts that they are spearheading, but we don't know what her stake is in it. And based on what Luthen said, it sounds like they are just compatriots in this situation. There's no romantic connection, there's no familial connection. So what is the deal with her and her backstory, and what is their deal together? How did they end up working together? I'm so curious about this, and we are no closer to learning about Clea, and I hope that that is coming at some point. As far as Luthen goes, we've talked about where he is on the spectrum of behavior, with Mon Mothma being at one end, wanting to find ways to oppose the Empire but do it in as focused and targeted a way as possible, and then Saw Gerrera on the other end of the spectrum, deciding that he's going to fight the Empire by any means necessary, and anybody who gets in the way is in danger and for all intents and purposes is considered an enemy combatant, even if they just happen to be at a party where Empire people are, basically. Something like that happened in the Rebel Rising novel by Beth Revis, and that was a rather shocking incident, but you get the gist of what I'm saying. We know Luthen exists on this spectrum somewhere, and the more we learn about him, the more it seems like he is closer to Saw Gerrera's side of things than Mon Mothma's side of things. Maybe he started out closer to Mon, but he's reached a point where he is definitely more towards Saw. We've kind of seen that in previous episodes when he decides that, all right, we really got to put a stick in the eye of the Empire, and Mon says, people are going to suffer for this, and his response is, yeah, basically, we need that to happen. Which then brings us to the conversation he's having with Lonnie Jung and the monologue that he gets to deliver. It really did feel like it was made for a stage play. Like I could see Andor on a stage with this situation playing out. And honestly, there are a lot of scenes that in the Andor series you could see being just as well executed on a stage as in a teleplay like this situation. I'm not going to go in order though, because it seems like we need to start with a statement that happens a little further on, where he says that he had an equation 15 years ago and arrived at one conclusion, that he would be damned for what he did. So that means that if we're looking 15 years back, that would actually technically put us right in the Clone Wars, in the final year of it. So the Republic would not have fallen by that point, but we could take 15 as a rough estimate and instead think of it in terms of the Empire actually falling and then him arriving at that conclusion that he was going to be damned for whatever he did as a result of his actions in response to the Empire rising. And despite the fact that we've had an idea that maybe he was closer to Mon Mothma's side of things all along, in this speech he seems to indicate that no, that's not necessarily the case, although maybe it took some time for him to make himself that way. He talks to Lonnie about how he made his mind a sunless space and that he's condemned himself to fighting with the Empire's weapons. But there's enough of the Mon Mothma side of him that realizes what it is he's done, and it seems to torture him on some level, and yet he is absolutely committed to the path that he's set himself on, even though he finds himself not necessarily on solid ground, as it were. Ethically, emotionally, all of the above and much more perhaps. And he's willing to make this sacrifice without anybody being aware of it, which is noble, I guess, to some degree. But he also talks about his ego and says that his ego won't have the satisfaction of some sort of public acclaim for what he's done, but he's certainly looking for that validation in his monologue to Lonnie here. So I don't get the feeling that he is completely egoless in this regard, and certainly his exchange with Saw Gerrera previously also suggests that he is not egoless in this whole enterprise. So speaking of that too, I do have to wonder whether the calculus about letting Krieger get sacrificed to the Imperials, whether that would have changed if Saw Gerrera had actually thrown in with Krieger, and I wonder what Saw is going to say to Luthen the next time they meet about that whole situation. But apparently, and also perhaps not so shockingly anymore, Krieger and his folks are not the only sacrifice that Luthen has made to keep his whole operation secret. According to what he tells Lonnie and reminds Lonnie of as Lonnie's riding down in the elevator, is that he's turned over information to Lonnie to help Lonnie's career escalate, and these are things that have, quote, cost Luthen dearly, unquote. Although it is hard to tell how honest he's being with Lonnie, because Lonnie asks him about Aldhani, and Luthen's response is, "We were invited, but we declined, and we build our operation, not on luck." But considering that Luthen is prepared to sacrifice Krieger in this situation does make me think that yes, he has actually sacrificed other folks as well. And that also strikes me as very egoic too. He has a mentality from where he's at that he is capable of and deserving to make the kinds of decisions that will be life or death for the pawns that he's putting out in the field. Ultimately, Luthen has become much richer and more complex a character after the events of this particular arc of the series. However, there's still a lot that we don't know about his backstory and how he arrived at that point. And even though he says he's sacrificed everything, we don't know what that really means, because we need to see what his life was before the Republic fell and how it affected his life when the Empire rose to power. So that would be fun to see at some point down the line. I don't know if we're going to necessarily see it in season 1, but Tony Gilroy did an interview with the Hollywood Reporter recently, and it does sure sound like Luthen's going to be around for at least part of season 2. And I gotta say, if Del Rey or Lucasfilm Press are listening, then by all means, hey, I think a Luthen backstory novel might be pretty fun too. Just saying. Anyway, so there you go. That's what I've got for you on a deeper dive into Luthen's monologue and his conversation with Lonnie Jung in the most recent episode of Andor, and that is going to do it for this episode of the podcast. It just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for it, as always, and may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2021 by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.